Yo. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the bizarre and disturbing documentary Iceberg, made by, me. It's been a hot minute since the last Iceberg series on this channel, but this year I have some pretty big ones planned. And to start it all off, I'd like to take you all on a journey through the world of the weirdest, most disturbing, and most interesting documentaries ever made. I should note from the start here that there really isn't much of a structure to this iceberg. From tier 1 to tier, whatever the last one ends up being, you will be hit with funny, silly, strange documentaries about oddball people, fandoms, and what have you, to some of the most disturbing, obscure, and at times truly sickening and upsetting documentaries ever made as well. You never know what the next entry will bring, but I suppose I'll try and have some of the more popular or famous documentaries closer to the top, and maybe some of the more obscure ones near the bottom, but again, there will be stuff spread throughout the whole thing, so you'll just have to wait and see. And beyond just the documentaries, if there's any extra information or updates to any of the stories or people or events that happen in any of these said documentaries since then I'll also be sure to note that with each individual entry. But with all that preamble out of the way, sit back, relax, and get ready to stick around for a while as we dive deep into the world of true, strange, and disturbing stories. The Tiger King. So to start things off, I suppose we ought to look at one of the most popular and influential documentaries in recent time. The Tiger King, often subtitled with Murder, Mayhem, and Madness, is a true crime documentary series on Netflix that dives into the bizarre, volatile world of the private cat owners in the United States. At the center is Joe Exotic, an eccentric Oklahoma zoo owner locked in a long-running feud with animal rights activist Carol Baskin. The series unravels escalating rivalries, allegations of animal abuse, fraud, cult-like workplaces, and general conspiracy, ultimately culminating in Joe Exotic's arrest and conviction for attempting to hire a hitman to kill his rival Carol Baskin. The series itself is rather gripping, and a big part of the reason why is just how interesting and entertaining Joe Exotic, real name Joseph Allen Melando, truly is. Joe was born in 1963 in Kansas, and raised in a conservative rural environment. By most accounts, his youth was deeply unhappy, however. He was openly gay in an era and place where that brought harassment and abuse. Joe later admitted that he was sexually assaulted as a teenager, a trauma he said profoundly shaped his personality. After being outed to his family, he described being rejected and emotionally isolated afterward. And into his early 20s, Joe apparently attempted by crashing his police cruiser into a bridge embankment. He survived somehow, but was badly injured. This moment became a psychological pivot point for him, however, as afterward, Joe increasingly reinvented himself through larger-than-life personas, treating his very own identity as something performative and ultimately disposable. And that persona that he would end up creating would be that of Joe Exotic, a man who is loud, proud, and kind of fucking crazy, to be honest. And it's through this persona that he eventually established what became the Greater Wynwood Exotic Animal Park in Wynwood, Oklahoma, or the GW Zoo as it would come to be known. The zoo was chaotic, underfunded, and packed with tigers, bred for cub petting attractions. And somehow, despite this place having literal fucking tigers to pet and look at, as well as various other rather large animals such as lions and chimpanzees and exotic birds and what have you, the most crazy and attention-grabbing aspect of the zoo was perhaps Joe Exotic himself. He's a bizarre character who is in equal parts a bad and abusive person who sort of uses others around him to get what he wants, and yet is endlessly charismatic and funny. There's a story here about a real eccentric who made a name both online and in his local community with his zoo, but also with his overall personality, as he walks around with a bleached mullet, tattoos all over, a gun at the ready at his hip, that he'll often fire without much provocation at random stuff. He's a libertarian, he's animal-loving, and he's also a gay man in a polyamorous relationship with a whole crew of cripples and ex-cons working in his den of tigers, lions, and other such animals. It's kind of hard to not get swept up in the strangeness of it all, or even root for him just a bit at first, especially when the other character much of the documentary focuses on is that of Carol Baskin, who is her own brand of crazy, but also has a rather messed up backstory herself. Carol is an animal rights activist best known as the founder and CEO of Big Cat Rescue, a non-profit sanctuary in Florida dedicated to rescuing abused, abandoned, or exploited big cats, with her public mission being to end the private ownership and breeding of big cats, especially cub petting attractions and roadside zoos like that of Joe Exotics, of whom she accused for years of abusing animals and exploiting cubs for profit. Sounds fair until you come to understand how she got where she was today. See, back in 1991, Carol married a man named Don Lewis. Don Lewis was a wealthy Florida businessman with an interest in real estate and big cat ownership. He lived a secretive lifestyle, flew small planes, and frequently traveled, particularly to Costa Rica, where he owned property and reportedly kept assets. However, so the story goes, the two eventually grew apart, and Dawn planned on divorcing Carol, which would mean all her big cats and her whole sanctuary that she had kind of built with Dawn up until that point would be lost, out of her hands and strictly into Dawn's. Dawn apparently also feared there were people trying to kill him at this point in time, and even filed a restraining order against Carol in 1997 after she threatened him. All of this would come to head when on August 18th of 1997, Don Lewis would vanish, last being seen early in the morning near a Tampa airport, his van being found abandoned near a small airstrip. He left behind millions in assets, ongoing disputes, and no clear explanations, and pretty quickly his disappearance was looked into, possibly being foul play by Carol, but no body was ever found, nor was there any concrete evidence of this to be found. And by 2002, Lewis was legally declared dead, which suspiciously, in his will, had 90% of his assets he owned then go into the hands of Carol Baskin, leaving only 10% for the rest of his family. To just about anyone with a working brain, this whole thing seemed rather suspicious, and this was something that Joe Exotic really leaned into when mocking and fighting against Carol in legal and online YouTube battles. Battles that would eventually lead into financial trouble for Joe and the zoo. And while much of it is rather complex to talk about in detail, the long story short version is that after a ton, and I do mean a ton of drama, including at one point Joe Exotic running for fucking president of the United States, and then eventually governor of his state of Oklahoma, as well as getting involved with an even shadier dude by the name of Jeff Lowe, who brought with him even more ex-cons, as well as Joe Exotic losing his legal battle to Carol and owing her fucking tons of money that he just simply didn't have. At some point, allegedly, Joe Exotic hired one of those ex-cons Jeff Lowe had brought with him to the zoo to kill Carol Baskin in a hitman sort of job. Now this is disputed, but ultimately, Joe Exotic would end up in prison, not just for this, but also violations against the Lacey Act and Endangered Species Act, and resulted in a 22-year federal prison sentence for him. Though there are some talks about him possibly getting out by 2030, so I suppose we'll have to see how all that goes. What I think is really interesting about this documentary in general, though, is beyond the very gripping story and unique characters, is how influential the series would be on documentaries not just on Netflix, but also in a larger way the internet and the interest of people on it. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, to put it simply, when season 1 of this series came out in March of 2020, it was watched by 34 million people over the first 10 days of its release, ranking as one of Netflix's most successful releases to date. And this was partly due to the fact that it was released during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, where most people were isolating themselves within their homes. This would cause a ton of people to make memes and other such stuff based around Joe, and in particular Carol Baskin, since while most agreed Joe was a shady guy and probably deserved some jail time, Carol Baskin was just as, if not more shady, with how she came into wealth. And so many went online to express just that. However, as all the excitement started to die down, the question then became clear. Okay, so what's next? Where can I find stories about other really weird people? What other people have hours of lore and insane online wars, and possible legal battles that I can sink my teeth into now? Of course, this would result in Tiger King getting a season 2, focusing on more parts of the story, as well as season 3, which focused almost exclusively on Doc Antle, a more minor character in the main series, but a guy who, like Joe, had his own zoo, but also seemed to have a harem of women around him, an entire operation that frankly ran like a cult, with Doc as the supreme ruler of the land. However, both season 2 and 3 would end up coming a year later. And while there would be, and will be, more documentaries like this on this iceberg, produced by Netflix and the like, these sorts of documentary series that keeps you hooked with cliffhangers at the end of episodes and tons of interesting drama, there was a different place that already had a ton of other documentaries just like that for anyone to go watch for free. And that, of course, was YouTube. And it's why around this point in time, people like Chris Chan and Geno Samuel's documentary series on him started to gain a far larger rise in popularity. A result of the pandemic and people having more time to sink into endless hours of lore and the stuff that they might not have ever cared or given the time of day to before. Or to put it a different way, people learning and getting invested into lolcows became more mainstream. It was peak, this shit doesn't matter but I'm really interested and entertained by it hours. And Joe Exotic, if nothing else, is certainly a lolcow, and one that despite everything, you can't help but kind of gawk at. Though that does beg the question, where are all these people now? Well, Joe's still in prison, obviously, and while in there, he actually wrote an autobiography titled Tiger King, the official tell-all memoir, which was released in November 9th of 2021. Then on May 14th of 2021, it was reported that Exotic had been diagnosed with prostate cancer. It was apparently quite aggressive, but it was seemingly handled for a while, until it came back sometime in 2025. Those doctors say that he should be able to live with it for another 10 or 15 years or so. So for the time being, he's not taking any treatment for it. And on October of 2024, Joe announced his engagement to a fellow inmate named Jorge Marquez, and the two officially got married on April of 2025. However, when Jorge was released from prison on May of 2025, he was immediately deported to Mexico for illegal entry into the United States. As for Carol Baskin, well, that's rather interesting. On one hand, she was successful in her life mission of sorts, with her Big Cat Public Safety Act being signed into law on December 20th of 2022 by President Joe Biden. The bill closed the loopholes in the Captive Wildlife Safety Act that she lobbied for, and with that effectively phases out / bans private zoos and ownerships of big cats in the United States. This, however, applied to her as well, and since all this went down, if you go and check out her social media posts, she's posting random AI-generated videos of tigers and cats, and making videos where she addresses and gives tons of attention to some of the random comments in her comment section that mock her or troll her or whatever, with her apparently growing far more paranoid of someone breaking into her house to hurt her or whatever, which is ironic in a sense, I suppose.
She needed help looking for Don. I know he's been missing for a while, and maybe you haven't had the right people, helping you look for him. If you do need any help, just give me a call back. I'm here. I know you must be very upset he's missing. But anyways, got a lot of people ready to help you find him. Just let us know. Bye.
Well, he's about 23 years late. So I have been saving all of those and then putting them into categories which are people who are really threatening, saying, I know where you live, I'm coming to kill you, things like that, versus the ones who are just being idiots like this guy. I have to accept it on my computer, then block the caller, and then delete the call.
Did you do it? Was it you? Was it you? Did you kill it? I thought it was you. It was you, for sure. It wasn't him.
And so many of these people are clearly prepubescent children, and it makes me wonder, what are they doing with phones? Maybe I'm an old fogey, but I just can't believe that children are allowed to go around harassing people like that. Where is your mother?
But yeah, on the whole, she sort of seems like she's lost whatever was left of her mind. And now her feed just kind of looks like the typical Facebook boomer with a bunch of paranoid rants and the occasional AI cat video. Others like Jeff Lowe eventually were arrested and lost their business here and had to move to Mexico to keep their personal zoo stuff going on, while Doc Antle faced federal indictments for wildlife trafficking and money laundering. Effectively, every one of the major players in this game of big cats and what have you in this documentary were taken down through one means or another, ending the story on a sort of mutual destruction as a whole. I suppose at the end of it all, though, at least the tigers and animals are all in better sanctuaries and are better being taken care of as a whole.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you like pizza, pasta, or chicken Alfredo, I can promise you Zooters is the place you want to stop. It's right in front of the Greater Winterwood Exotic Animal Park. You don't have to enter the zoo to sit down and have some of the world's famous pizza, a cold beer, something else to drink, and sit down in an atmosphere next to tigers that you have never experienced anywhere in the world. Yep, you heard me right. You can sit down on the patio right next to real live tigers, and you can have some of the best homemade pizza that I make from scratch. And that's a Joe Exotic promise.
Glass Action Park. Some of you theme park history video enjoyers might already be familiar with this one, as this documentary is all about the infamous Action Park of Vernon, New Jersey, known simultaneously for its anarchy-based freedom and its staggering record for injuries, lawsuits, and deaths. This particular documentary blends archival footage, interviews, and dark humor to explore how a place remembered fondly by many as a symbol of reckless youth also embodied profound negligence and straight-up insanity at times with how some of these rides, or hell, most of the rides, were designed. I mean, just look at this fucking slide. What part of this screams good idea? The film gives some focus to the park's owner, Gene Mulliville, who is this charismatic and confrontational entrepreneur who envisioned a park where visitors, mostly teenagers, were given unprecedented autonomy. Rides were often poorly designed, minimally supervised, and sometimes built without professional engineers. Guests were encouraged to push limits, while employees, again many of them teenagers themselves, were undertrained, underpaid, and frequently intoxicated. This environment fostered a culture where danger was not an accident, but an expectation. Several of the attractions are given highlight as well, from the looping water slide, the alpine slide, and the cannonball loop, which again looks like this. These rides were frequently modified through trial and error, with park employees sometimes serving as the test subjects. The documentary recounts how injuries ranging from broken bones to severe lacerations were commonplace, and how emergency rooms nearby came to anticipate daily influxes of action park casualties, which is already pretty crazy in of itself. But again, there is that tinge of dark humor all about the documentary, with little illustrations and animations sometimes showcasing what certain rides or attractions looked like. There's an interesting tone that goes between former employees and patrons, recounting their experiences with nostalgia, pride, and laughter, describing the park as a kind of rite of passage that fostered independence and resilience, which when paired with the archival footage and photos, is kind of hard to not get swept up in a little bit. Like, I don't wish to do any of the main activities here since, you know, I don't really plan on dying at a fucking water park of all things, but I almost wish I could have been there to see it in action, just a little bit, you know? To be a fly on the wall and watch the madness all play out on the daily. After all, even without the dangerous slides and rides, there was also just parties and events thrown there all of the time. This fond remembrance from all these patrons and employees, though, is placed in stark tension with interviews from journalists, safety experts, and victims' families, who underscore the very real human cost of the park's lax safety culture. The film resists offering a single moral verdict either, instead allowing these conflicting perspectives to coexist since, I suppose, at the end of the day, both are true. Something can be dangerous and in need of shutting down, and yet still exciting and fun for those who experienced it and didn't die during it, I suppose. In the latter half of the film, a significant portion is devoted to the legal and moral reckoning surrounding the park. Over the years, Action Park was linked to multiple deaths, including drownings and accidents on the various rides. The park faced numerous lawsuits, yet often avoided lasting consequences through legal maneuvering, political connections, and aggressive public relations. Of course, if it wasn't obvious, this did not last forever, and eventually, after changing hands, Action Park would come to close down, though it did seem to change hands quite a few times. Currently it goes by Mountain Creek Water Park, but for a while it was actually trying to rebrand itself as Action Park yet again, I guess to try to capture that nostalgia, but all it really did was kind of put a bad taste in everyone's mouth, even if all the rides and attractions are far less bizarre and work much better and are much safer now, which is probably for the best. But nonetheless, seeing such a bizarre water park really does feel like looking into a different world at times. A very different time and space, when this sort of thing was allowed to just kind of exist for years. It makes for an equally funny as well as tragic watch, depending on which person is telling the story.
Baby, let me take you where the action's hot. Action, action, park. We can ride the excitement and feel the park rock. Action, action, park. The action never stops at Action Park.
Looking for a great place for the family this summer? Well, Action Park has 75 of the wildest, wettest family rides in the world just minutes away.
The action never stops at Action Park.
Blackfish. This 2013 documentary examines the ethics and consequences of keeping orcas in captivity, using the story of a single whale, that of Tilikum, as its core foundation, as well as interviews from former trainers, archival footage, and expert testimony, all of which add up to a directed critique at SeaWorld and the broader marine entertainment industry as a whole, for their practices and how many have died, both man and whale alike, due to all of it. From the offset, the film notes how orcas are considered highly intelligent, social animals with complex emotional lives and strong family bonds. In the wild, orcas live in tight-knit pods, communicate through distant vocal dialects, and can travel vast distances each day. Blackfish contrasts this natural behavior with the reality of captivity: small concrete tanks, social isolation, artificial groupings, and the psychological stress imposed by confinement. A recount of the orca Tilikum story then plays out, from him being captured near Iceland in the early 1980s, and then later transferred to SeaWorld, and how he has a history of repeated involvement in human deaths. Most prominently, it examines the 2010 killing of trainer Don Bronchu at SeaWorld Orlando, and rather than portraying the incident as an unpredictable accident, which is how SeaWorld seemed to have spun the story at the time, Blackfish situates it within a pattern of aggression from Tilikum that was ultimately brought on from the prolonged stress and isolation that the whale faced, including at times being torn up by the female whales. Many of the former SeaWorld employees describe entering the job with genuine love for the animals and the belief in SeaWorld's educational mission, only to then become disillusioned over time. They allege that the company downplayed the dangers of working with orcas, discouraged discussion of past incidents, and promoted a sanitized public image that omitted the risks and ethical concerns of captivity of these animals. Even at the time, straight up lying about the whales' natural lifespans, and even stuff like them saying how it's a natural aging process for their top fins to eventually bend, which in reality doesn't happen in the wild outside of extremely rare cases, but pretty much is a guarantee for all male orcas in captivity. The documentary argues that the company framed orcas as safe, friendly performers, while suppressing footage and information about aggressive behavior and trainer injuries. Training techniques including food deprivation and forced performance are presented as methods of control rather than care for the animals, with SeaWorld seemingly caring more about the profits than the animals' welfare, or that of the employees' safety even. The film also has some pretty disturbing scenes, in particular, one where there's a close call, as one of the whales pulls under a trainer under the water for extended periods of time. There is a real sense of ominous dread in some of the footage that is shown, whether anyone actually ended up dying in it or not. Ultimately, Blackfish ended up impacting SeaWorld a fair bit financially, with their stocks going down and the park attendance slipping, and eventually of time, the choice was made in 2016 to make it so that they no longer breed orcas, nor capture new orcas for their parks, meaning that at the very least, this will be the last generation of orcas in captivity, at SeaWorld at least. It still very much goes on in other parts of the world. SeaWorld also apparently stopped having them do traditional shows with tricks and what have you, instead have educational encounters with them now.
Something comes over people at SeaWorld. There must be something in the water.
The Grizzly Man. This one is quite the doozy, primarily because of its extremely, how do I put this, interesting subject matter, and really everything surrounding his life and his ultimate goals. Grizzly Man examines the life, beliefs, and death of Timothy Treadwell, an environmental activist who spent 13 summers living among wild grizzly bears in Alaska's Katmai National Park, constructed largely from Treadwell's own video footage. The film is both a portrait of obsession and a philosophical meditation on nature, illusion, and the limits of human idealism. Timothy Treadwell himself was born on April 29th of 1957, under the name Timothy William Dexter, and from a very young age, Tim loved animals. At one point, he kept a squirrel named Willie as a pet. He seemed to have his whole life ahead of him. He attended Bradley University on a swimming and diving scholarship, and while he was there, he kind of created a false persona for himself, claiming that he was a British orphan, and other times he claimed that he was from Australia instead. Later on, he then moved to LA to pursue an acting career. However, this didn't end up going anywhere, and in particular, he sort of spiraled into a deep depression after he lost the role of Woody Boyd to Woody Harrelson in the sitcom Cheers, which would have certainly launched his career and all of his dreams if he had gotten it instead. He would then, in 1987, change his surname from Dexter to Treadwell, and would begin his new lifelong mission, with much of the documentary focusing on Treadwell's self-appointed role as a protector of grizzly bears. Treadwell believed that the grizzlies were under constant threat from poachers and human encroachment, so he camped alone in remote wilderness areas, often within feet of massive wild bears, watching, filming, and I guess in his mind, protecting them. He also filmed himself speaking directly to the camera, narrating his experiences in highly emotional, theatrical monologues that oscillate between childlike wonder, rage, and self-mythologizing. Through these recordings, Treadwell presented himself as a bridge between humans and nature, a guardian who believes that he has been accepted by the bears as one of their own. He, is, quite delusional if you couldn't figure it out by now. The documentary juxtaposes Treadwell's idealistic self-image with interviews from park rangers, scientists, indigenous Alaskans, and former friends. These voices provide a stark counterpoint, emphasizing that grizzly bears are not misunderstood friends, but that of apex predators, whose behavior cannot be safely predicted or emotionally negotiated with. The film highlights how Treadwell's refusal to carry bear spray or firearms, combined with his disregard for park regulations, placed both himself and others at risk. In fact, his very presence was habituating bears to humans, potentially endangering the very animals that he sought to protect. Werner Herzog, the director and narrator for the film, while also being quite fair in showcasing Treadwell's perspective and outlook on life, does not shy away at all from noting how he fundamentally disagrees with Treadwell. In fact, I find this aspect of the documentary very well done, as at times it almost feels like there is a philosophical battle about nature going on in the background. Herzog openly rejects Treadwell's belief that nature is harmonious and benevolent, arguing instead that it is indifferent, chaotic, and governed by survival. This thematic clash elevates the documentary beyond biography, turning it into a meditation on how humans project meaning onto the natural world through one means or another.
Perfection belonged to the bears. But once in a while, Treadwell came face to face with the harsh reality of wild nature. This did not fit into his sentimentalized view that everything out there was good and the universe in balance and in harmony. Male bears sometimes kill cubs to stop the females from lactating and thus have them ready again for fornication.
Oh, God. I love you. I love you, and I don't understand. It's a painful world.
Here I differ with Treadwell. He seemed to ignore the fact that in nature there are predators. I believe the common denominator of the universe is not harmony, but chaos, hostility, and murder.
Perhaps neither are fully correct or fully wrong, but it's interesting all the same. Where Treadwell sees friendship and love in the eyes of bears, Herzog sees the overwhelming indifference of nature. It all building towards the tragedy that perhaps everyone could have seen coming a moon away, when Treadwell eventually comes to die at the paws of a bear. In 2003, during a season when bears were more aggressive due to food scarcity, Treadwell and his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, were killed and partially eaten by a bear in their campsite. The audio of the attack was recorded accidentally, though Herzog refuses to include it in the film, choosing instead to describe it a bit obliquely, and noting how he thinks the audio should be destroyed. This is one of the worst things that he's apparently ever heard, though admittingly it does kind of make me wonder what the audio exactly sounded like. Call it morbid curiosity. In its aftermath, Grizzly Man examines the consequences of Treadwell's choices. The bear involved in the attack was killed by authorities. Friends and interviewees express a mixture of admiration, grief, frustration, and anger, acknowledging Treadwell's passion while condemning the recklessness that led to his death and the loss of animal life, as well as that of his girlfriends. Ultimately, Grizzly Man is not simply a cautionary tale about wildlife safety. It's a complex character study of a man searching for meaning, redemption possibly, and even identity through fucking Mother Nature. An action often taken by man in the words of fine literature. And just as those works of old, this documentary showcases a real tragedy of someone who refused to accept reality, and in the end was swallowed up by reality when he refused to awake from his dreams. Though he is admittingly pretty funny, so at least there's that.
With these grizzly bears, you're surrounded by them. They're very close to you. Is that how you live with them?
Yes, I always give them respect and lots of room because, you know, a grizzly's the boss out there.
But you interact with them?
It's important that every bear knows who I am and that I fit on their hierarchy if I'm to survive.
Is it going to happen that one day we read a news article about you being eaten by one of these bears?
No, you know, and
Tickled. Alright, so this one's going to be especially strange. Tickled begins as a lighthearted investigation into an odd internet subculture and gradually transforms into a disturbing exploration of coercion and secrecy, and someone pulling all the strings of hundreds if not thousands of people all over the world, all connected through videos of people being tickled. The film starts with David Ferrier's discovery of videos depicting young men participating in competitive tickling matches, often presented as playful sports content. The participants are shown restrained, tickled by others, and subjected to endurance challenges, with the videos marketed as a kind of wholesome, non-sexual entertainment. Intrigued by the strangeness between the imagery and the framing, Ferrier reaches out to the companies producing the videos, expecting either a harmless explanation or a niche fetish community openly acknowledging itself. Instead, Ferrier and Reeve are met with aggressive legal threats, personal attacks, and attempts at intimidation. These hostile responses become the documentary's turning point. Rather than deterring the investigation, the threats signal that something is being deliberately concealed. And so the filmmakers begin tracing the origins of the tickling enterprises on the internet, uncovering a network of shell companies, aliases, and legal maneuverings designed to obscure ownership and accountability. It's genuinely a wild ride that keeps getting more and more bizarre as both David Ferrier and Dylan Reeve dive deeper into this strange culture and the many players within it, as they come to find that not only is this tickling fetish and the videos produced around it have been a thing since the very early days of the internet, and that the key players within it hold real power over the people who come to play in these videos, but in particular there seems to be one person who seems to have supreme control over this entire niche of weird fetish porn videos, and immediately jumps to threatening legal battles over anyone who dares question them or look deeper into any of their involvement, despite their involvement being kind of self-evident everywhere. As the investigation deepens, Tickled reveals that many participants were recruited through online advertisements offering easy money to young men, often under misleading pretenses. Those who attempted to leave or speak out describe being subjected to harassment, blackmail, and lawsuits to keep their mouths shut. personal information was allegedly used as leverage to silent dissent, turning what initially appeared to be a consensual participation into a system of manipulation and control. This all eventually comes to a head when it's finally revealed who the person behind all this craziness is. A man who often pretends to be a woman alias online, a man by the name of David D. Amato. This greasy-looking gentleman, who they come to find at one point had actually served a 6-month prison sentence in the past, back when he used to go under the online alias of Terry Tickle. Him serving that sentence because he had disabled the computer systems at 2 different universities in retaliation against an 18-year-old male student who attempted to terminate an online relationship with him, which began when the young man was 17, might I add. Very fucked up shit, and also just crazy beyond belief. It makes you wonder why any one person would go this far for tickling videos, but it all kinda makes sense when you start to see the way D'Amato writes and acts towards nearly everyone online. He acts like he's a god or fucking Light Yagami, but over fucking tickle fetish videos. It's honestly pretty damn funny if it also wasn't pretty messed up, since he is actually blackmailing people, in particular young men and even teen men. However, in the end, David Farrier and Dylan Reeve confront David D'Amato when he goes to get some Starbucks coffee, and then the tables are turned on him a bit, as all that intimidation and fluff he did online falls away to nothing quite soon after. It seems that he was a bit shocked that anyone actually found out who he really was and was able to confront him IRL. It's overall a pretty good documentary and deep dive into this strange fetish video ring. And as far as updates go since the release of that documentary, David D'Amato died to a severe heart attack that was brought on by several factors, including diabetes and general obesity. And considering that the dude enjoyed blackmailing people online and watching videos of teen boys being tickled and bullying anyone into submission with money he got from his inheritance, not even having worked a single day in his life over any of this stuff, I'd say it's fair to say to rest in piss to this dude. Of course, with how elusive he is and how embarrassing the doc made about him was, some thought that his death was actually faked, since he had kinda done things like that in the past. But David Farrier actually did present via Twitter, as well as some interviews, David D'Amato's actual death certificate. So, yeah, The Cove. Released in 2009, The Cove is an investigative documentary directed by Luis Cejoyos that exposes the secretive annual dolphin hunt held in Taiji, Japan. The film is kind of a combination of environmental activism with covert filmmaking techniques, making it, if nothing else, a pretty interesting watch. The documentary is anchored by Rick O'Barry, a former dolphin trainer best known for working on the television series Flipper, which of course featured a rather intelligent dolphin. Rick was once a proponent of dolphin captivity, until he experienced a moral awakening of sorts after witnessing a dolphin die in his arms, an event he interpreted as an act of willful despair, believing that the dolphin had chosen to kill itself in his arms. This moment transformed him into a lifelong critic of dolphin entertainment and captivity. At the center of the film is the coastal town of Taiji, where local fishermen drive dolphins into a secluded inlet each year. There, some dolphins are selected for sale to marine parks around the world, while others are killed for meat. The operation is hidden behind tarps and guarded by authorities, preventing journalists and activists from witnessing the event directly. The Cove frames this secrecy as a deliberate effort to shield the practice from international condemnation. To expose what happens inside the Cove, Cejoyos assembles a team of activists, divers, and technologists who use spy-style techniques, hidden cameras and underwater microphones, and night operations to document the hunt. Makes the film almost have a strange spy film sort of setup and pacing, which I do kinda dig. Though fair warning, this documentary does not shy away from showing the brutality of the dolphin slaughter when it does eventually get shown. The ocean in the area ends up turning a deep crimson red from all the blood after it's all done. Beyond this, the movie also notes how killing dolphins could be ethically wrong, but also there could be a real health risk to eating them as well, as dolphin meat is particularly high in mercury content, with the film arguing that the local populations are misled about the true dangers of the consumption of this meat. The documentary is pretty steadfast in its one goal in showcasing this stuff, and this did cause some controversy surrounding it after its release, with the Taiji government, citing how the film was one-sided, seemed anti-Japanese in sentiment, and how it is a tradition for these hunts to take place. Since the release of the film, a much larger number of activists, mainly non-Japanese, began to visit Taiji to protest or film the dolphin hunts. The Taiji fishermen responded by constructing an elaborate structure of tarps to better conceal the drive hunting activities in and around the cove. Since then, there has actually been 2 response documentaries made on the subject, one by filmmaker Keiko Yagi, the documentary titled Behind the Cove, which presented the side of the Taiji fishermen and had the aim of challenging Western media narratives about Japan's dolphin hunting practices. A major focus of the film is its critique of Rico Berry, the activist central in the Cove. Behind the Cove questions his credibility and motivations, highlighting his past career as a dolphin trainer and suggesting contradictions between his former participation in captivity and his later activism. Another central argument concerns double standards in global food ethics, as well as the tactics used to film the events on the Cove. That response doc never really got very much high praise internationally though, but was generally praised by the locals and I guess some of the Japanese viewers. The other response documentary, directed by Megumi Sasaki, titled A Whale of Tale, released in 2018, then examined the legacy of the original documentary and the cultural divide between Western activists who have continued to travel to Japan to protest the Taiji dolphin drive hunt for many years after the film's release, and the local population. It argues that dolphin meat consumption in Japan was already in decline, and that the Cove and the subsequent Western activism has been poorly received by the local population, and used by Japanese nationalists to garner support to actually continue the practice, meaning that the activists are now doing far more bad than good at this point, in continuing to go there to protest, since, to them, they're just a bunch of foreigners screaming at them for stuff that they've always done. Don't Fuck with Cats. Don't Fuck with Cats, Hunting an Internet Killer from 2019 is a true crime documentary series that explores how online vigilantism, internet culture, and obsession collide in the pursuit of a violent criminal. Though, there is some issues that I have with this one that I'm gonna have to note a little bit here shortly. But to start, the documentary opens with the appearance of a disturbing video circling around the internet, depicting the abuse and killing of 2 kittens. And it's in a pretty brutal fashion as well. Outraged, viewers who saw this terrible clip begin to form informal online groups dedicated to identifying the perpetrator of this terrible crime against kittenkind. And the documentary in particular focuses on a Facebook group and the investigators of said Facebook group, most prominently that of Deanna Thompson and John Green, as they and their group painstakingly analyze visual clues, metadata, and online behavior of that cat killer to try and get any info that they could to find out who this sick person was. As the group eventually narrows down on a suspect, the documentary introduces then that of Luca Mignata, a deeply narcissistic individual with a history of identity fabrication, attention-seeking, and general online self-mythologizing. The series reveals that Mignata actively courted notoriety, manipulating online audiences and planting false leads to keep himself at the center of attention. This revelation reframes the investigation. The hunters may also be feeding the very ego that drives the violence. However, despite the documentary focusing on these 2 investigators and this Facebook group that tried to find out who the guy was before everyone found out it was Luke Mignata, there's something really strange about this documentary when it is revealed in it who the identity of the killer is. is kind of just revealed without any fanfare, despite it kind of building up like there was going to be a bit more fanfare to it. Like we were going to find out exactly how they found out it was this guy, when that just doesn't end up happening. So when it's revealed who the killer was, it's presented matter-of-factually before they then move on to the next part of the story. And that's because this whole Facebook group that they focus on so much during this documentary had, in fact, nothing. Zilch, zero to do with finding out who the cat killer was. If you all know the real OGs who found out who the one behind these terrible videos were, you can thank several Russian 4chan users for finding that information out. A fact that the documentary completely omits, and rather awkwardly presents as some random person revealing to Deanna Thompson that it was Luca in the videos via a Facebook DM. We are never given any info on who that person who gave her that info was, nor is any suspicion thrown onto the person who gave them that info either. Almost as if they made that up so that they could still maintain that these people are the main characters of this investigation, despite that just not really being the case. I don't know, don't get me wrong, the documentary is interesting, and the story of Luca takes some truly dark and fucked up turns. It's truly crazy in its own right. But I gotta call out when a documentary omits information, or just strangely is afraid of acknowledging info many others happen to already know. But that general nitpicking aside, the documentary's tone darkens as Mignata escalates from animal cruelty to the murder of that of June Lin in 2012, made rather infamous by the fact that this murder was filmed and put out onto the internet under the video title One Maniac, One Ice Pick. June Lin was an international student living in Montreal, and the killing was premeditated and exceptionally brutal. And what's more, is after the murder, Mignata dismembered Lin's body, and then proceeded to mail several body parts to Canadian political offices and schools, deliberately provoking fear in media coverage. Mignata fairly quickly fled Canada at that point and traveled across Europe, seemingly tracking media reports about himself as the manhunt intensified. He was ultimately arrested in Berlin after being recognized in an internet cafe, where he was reportedly reading news stories about his own case. And with his arrest and extradition back to Canada, it marked the end of one of the most high-profile criminal cases of the internet era. In 2014, Mignata was convicted of first-degree murder and multiple related offenses, receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for up to 25 years. Like I said, the documentary is on an interesting subject matter, and one that is especially dark and fucked up. I do find the entire subject of how no matter one's creed, politics, or otherwise, if you hurt animals on the internet, especially cats, people will go out of their way to track you down, to stop you from being able to hurt more animals, or to get justice through one means or another. I suppose I should say that while there is descriptions of what happens in the cat videos, you can watch this one knowing that they don't actually show the full-on videos in the documentary. Like I said, I wish they expanded into other websites that also went into looking for this kitty killer as well, and not just this random Facebook group. I know that they are apparently pretty popular for this sort of thing, but it feels like the documentary is just a little bit limited in its reach, when in totality there were so many websites going after this guy that it actually could have been far more interesting to see every different place's methods of trying to discover him. But, oh well. FYRE Festival. Some of you might be familiar with this one based on how viral and crazy it was when it was all going down at the time, as well as the Internet Historian video on the subject. But in this documentary, FYRE, the greatest party that never happened, made in 2019, directed by Chris Smith, chronicles the spectacular rise and collapse of the FYRE Festival, a luxury music event that promised elite indulgence and instead delivered absolute chaos and heaping amounts of embarrassment. Film centers on Billy McFarlane, a young tech entrepreneur who envisioned FYRE Festival as both a high-end music experience and a promotional engine for a new booking app, marketed as an exclusive getaway on a Bahamian island once owned by Pablo Escobar. The festival was sold through sleek videos and coordinated influencer posts featuring models, yachts, pristine beaches, and promises of experiences that are both exclusive and like nothing that anyone's ever experienced before. It needless to say, got a lot of influencers, e-celebs, models, and people of that sort of variety quite excited. Behind the glossy facade, however, the documentary reveals an operation built on denial and improvisation. Organizers ignored repeated warnings from engineers and logistics experts, as well as the local authorities and locals in general, that the festival's goals were impossible to get done within the timeline and budget that Billy had set out for it. Infrastructure was never completed. Permits were inadequate, and basic necessities such as housing, food, sanitation, all of that. Pretty much every aspect of this beyond just the sale pitch of it were treated as afterthoughts. And as the event date approached, McFarlane reportedly responded to setbacks not by scaling back or canceling events or tickets, but by doubling down on false assurances. Or to put it another way, it was slowly becoming clear that they were about to get stranded in shit creek without a paddle. And no matter how many times or how it was worded or how it was presented to Billy, he just straight up didn't listen to anyone. The film has a lot of interviews from staff, employees, and the FYRE brand in general, as well as some of the people who had planned on going to FYRE, or who ended up going there and, well, experienced what ended up happening. And so this documentary is just kind of watching a train rapidly approaching a cement wall. It's going to train wreck. It's going to be violent and bloody. But truth be told, is everyone could see the cement wall like literally miles away, and it could have been avoided had it been stopped at any moment during the train, speeding its way towards the cement wall, which makes the preceding train wreck to come all the more baffling and frankly pretty funny, since at some point it really seems like most involved deserved this, with how stunningly dumb the choices made around this whole event truly were. When the attendees finally arrived in April of 2017, the illusion collapsed instantly, though. Instead of luxury villas, guests found disaster relief tents. Gourmet meals were replaced by sparse sandwiches, which you can see here, this luxury cheese sandwich. Performances were cancelled, luggage was stranded, and panic was widespread at this point. Footage from the festival's unraveling circulated in real time on social media. It became a public spectacle, transforming FYRE from a symbol of aspiration into a global punchline within hours. The film concludes with the legal aftermath, McFarlane's arrest and conviction for wire fraud, and his sentencing to federal prison, as it is indeed revealed that this entire FYRE Festival was just a giant scam, not even an ambition thing, but just a scam by Billy McFarlane that he just kind of took everyone for a ride for. However, the film also suggests that this is more than likely not the last anyone has seen of Billy. He is, after all, rather smart and very charismatic, and he wouldn't be in jail for too long. On October 11th, 2018, McFarlane was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, and while he was there, he apparently tried to write a book and create a podcast using a prison phone, which he was not allowed to do. Then in April of 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, McFarlane requested compassionate release to avoid contracting the virus, with the reasoning being that he had asthma, and that he was especially vulnerable to the virus. His request was promptly fucking denied the same month though. After that, Billy's prison time would then come to an end on March 30th of 2022, and by November of 2022, Billy would tease his new business venture called PYRT, or PYRT, which he described as a virtual, immersive, decentralized reality. As far as I'm aware, this has gone literally nowhere in that time though. Then in April 2023, McFarlane announced via Twitter that FYRE Festival 2 is finally happening, which is a pretty bold thing to announce, considering how much of his life and money was quite literally thrown away in the so-called first one. And furthermore, who would be dumb enough to fall for this shit a second time after it became such a big public embarrassment? Well, according to Billy anyway, the first 100 tickets for FYRE 2 were on sale for $500, and despite no venue or date or a musical act being promised, apparently all the tickets sold out within that time frame. Is that true? Probably not. Though, I guess I wouldn't put it past people to do it as a joke now, or to be part of the larger story that would potentially be a FYRE Festival 2, which would no doubt be even worse than the first one, had it ever actually happened. Because regardless of FYRE Festival 2 being scheduled for May 30th of 2025, this time on Isla Mujeres in Quintana Roo, Mexico, it never ultimately happened. And part of the reason it might have never happened was because there was an investigation by the New York Times that found that the GPS coordinates of the festival pointed to a landless location in the ocean, off the coast of Cancun, which is pretty funny. After FYRE Festival 2 was ultimately postponed indefinitely, Billy McFarlane would then sell off the brand of FYRE on eBay of all things, because he felt like the brand had outgrown him. However, he was then subsequently quite disappointed at its low sale price of only $245,000, which is honestly way more than what it's worth, since it's just a joke company at this point that scammed a bunch of rich people. I'm not even sure who bought it and for what reason. Maybe that will come to light at some point, or maybe it won't. All the same though, I definitely recommend this documentary, as it's pretty interesting seeing the behind the scenes thinking and the overall scam that led to such a huge viral joke at the end of it all. Capturing the Friedmans. Okay, and now we're getting into the thick of some truly dark and frankly depressing documentaries. Capturing the Friedmans, made in 2003 and directed by Andrew Garcecki, is a deeply unsettling film that explores the collapse of a seemingly ordinary suburban family after allegations of child sexual abuse tear it apart. Told largely through home video footage recorded by the family themselves, the film resists easy conclusions, instead immersing the viewer in ambiguity, contradiction, and the fragility of the truth within the legal system. It all centering around the Friedman family of Great Neck, New York, and in particular that of Arnold Friedman, a school teacher who ran a computer class for children out of his home in the late 1980s. In 1987, police investigating child pornography mailed to Arnold uncovered accusations that he and his teenage son, Jesse Friedman, had sexually abused students during these classes. What followed was a rapid escalation. Numerous children came forward with allegations, and the case became one of the most explosive sex abuse prosecutions of the era. Rather than presenting the story through traditional interviews alone, Capturing the Friedmans relies heavily on the home videos shot by Arnold's sons Jesse, David, and Seth. These recordings, initially intended to document family life and later the family's disintegration, becomes the film's emotional core, as you quite literally get to witness the collapse of a family through all of these arguments, denial, fear, rage, and grief unfold in real time, creating an unsettling intimacy that blurs the boundary between private pain and public spectacle. It feels like things that we just shouldn't be seeing and yet are. It also begs to question the strange family dynamic that is there within the house, one where people just are recording each other, having extremely personal and heated arguments. There's not really any other way of putting it than saying it's just extremely upsetting. As the legal case progresses, the documentary exposes troubling aspects of said investigation. Interview techniques were used on the children, techniques that if they were used now would get a case pretty much thrown out entirely, as well as pressure placed on the families to produce accusations. And the atmosphere of panic surrounding child abuse in the late 1980s and early 1990s, often referred to as the Satanic Panic era, are all things that are examined critically through the film. Several former students later recant their expressed uncertainty about their testimony, raising questions about memory and suggestion, as well as the reliability of the mass allegations formed under the intense social pressure, with it at one point being suggested that while there might have been one or two bad things that happened in the neighborhood, the sheer volume of the cases of children apparently getting sexually assaulted or abused by Arnold and Jesse Friedman just seemed kind of way too crazy to be real, and that perhaps there became a strange competitive nature to the victimhood that was going on in the neighborhood. But regardless of whether things were true or not, at the end of the day, Arnold ultimately pleads guilty in the hopes that it will help Jesse not get convicted. But then Jesse ultimately does get convicted, who also pleads guilty, but maintains his innocence as an adult, arguing that his confession was coerced by fear of a far harsher sentence, and after everyone, from his mother to his own lawyer, insisting that he plead guilty, and that it was the only right choice to make at that point, because if he didn't, he was looking at life in prison. This would eventually, all the same, lead to Arnold committing suicide in prison a little bit later. The documentary does not attempt to definitively prove guilt or innocence of either one of these individuals, though. Instead, it foregrounds how plea bargainings, prosecutorial leverage, and public hysteria can distort outcomes regardless of the underlying truth. With I'd say the overall message of capturing the Friedmans being that some truths are just simply unknowable, the director deliberately withholding a clear verdict, forcing viewers to confront their own assumptions about justice and memory and morality. And the film also suggests that the legal system can produce resolutions without necessarily producing truths from them. It's also a story about how tragedy begets more tragedy. Like how the father, Arnold, from a young age, lived with his younger brother and mother, all sleeping in the same bedroom. They had this arrangement because her mother was divorced from their father, and this happened because Arnold's older sister unfortunately died of a blood infection. And because all these things happened, Arnold's mother would bring men into the room, and would end up having sex with them right in the same vicinity of both of her sons. This would cause Arnold to want to experiment doing the same things that he saw his mother do with all these men, which would then eventually lead to him having sex with his younger brother, and how this action ultimately turned both of them into a road of homosexuality, but specifically Arnold never losing interest in the sexual desire for children as he grew older, and how this shaped his relationships and the sort of thing that he would end up doing to kids in the future. And depending on who you believe, either eventually framing his younger son alongside him, or him eventually passing that evil on to his youngest son as well. But this documentary is also an extremely rare look into the perspective of the family of someone who has been accused of doing truly terrible, evil things, and the breaking down of the family completely. It's heartbreaking, especially when the mother seemed to get so much shit throughout the entire thing from all three of her sons, all because she refused to just fully side with her husband because she didn't know for sure if he was in fact a pedophile or not, which it seems to be the case that yes, he is. He might have not done the crazy things that many of the accusations in the case threw at him, which I'm not even going to describe because they're just that disturbing, but it's clear all the same that he was in fact a sexual deviant. So it's sad to see that all three of her sons took the father's side over hers. Though after all of this, the ending of the film actually kind of ends on a nice note, with Jesse being released from prison after serving his sentence, and eventually meeting up with his brother David, who is steadfast in his belief that both Jesse and his father were innocent. And then eventually, Jesse meets up with his mother, showing that after all this time, there was still some connection between them all. And that, I guess it's all water under the bridge at this point. Since then though, there's been a ton of legal stuff involving Jesse trying to get money from what he believes to be a wrongful conviction. And honestly, it's a pretty huge mess, by the sounds of it from my little bit of research into the topic. But the TLDR is nothing real has come from any of it, despite him trying on many occasions to try and have the original conviction overturned, or again to get some kind of compensation out of the whole thing. Though he's not alone in doing this, there is several people who are in support of Jesse at this point. As I said, many of the interrogation tactics that were used on the kids to get Jesse convicted in particular are now seen as extremely dangerous and bad, and again, if it was handled nowadays, would have had the entire case thrown out of court. And this goes alongside the fact that there is no actual physical evidence of Jesse doing anything to any of the kids. Whether this leads into anything or not is anyone's guess at this point. All the same though, I do highly recommend this documentary. It's very disturbing and very upsetting, so make sure you're prepared for that type of thing. Bullying for Columbine. Now this one is pretty famous and pretty controversial, as it pertains to a rather touchy subject, so let's dive into it. This 2002 documentary, directed and starring Michael Moore, centers around the infamous Columbine High School massacre, perpetrated by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. But more than that, the major point of the documentary is to use the Columbine High School massacre as its point of example to the question of why the United States experiences so much more gun violence than any other developed nations. The documentary opens with Moore engaging in an intentionally absurd act, opening a bank account that comes with a free gun. This sequence sets the film's tone, satirical, confrontational, and critical of how normalized firearms are within American life. From there, Moore shifts to the tragedy of the Columbine High School and the massacre that left 13 people dead and many other injured, before then Eric and Dylan ultimately turn the guns on themselves. And he sort of uses this as a springboard for why he believes there is a deeper societal problem. Throughout the film, Moore explores multiple commonly cited explanations for gun violence, such as violent video games, heavy metal music, movies, bullying, and mental illness, only to then undermine them. He contrasts the US with countries like Canada, where gun ownership is relatively common, but gun violence is rare. See, there is a bit of a strange issue underlying this whole documentary, because after looking at all these commonly used reasons for why Eric and Dylan did what they did, all these explanations that the media gave out at the time, Moore seems to refuse to then acknowledge the darker reality of the situation. That being that the both of them were cruel, twisted bullies who did what they did because they wanted to cause harm. They wanted to hurt others, and to scare others, and to have a legacy of doing this. Instead, Moore seems to suggest that guns beget gun violence. But the issue with that is it really isn't that far off from simply saying that the violent games or films were an influence, since it's still blaming an object, or art, something other than the actual individuals who caused the crime, and an object that plenty of other people use or have used without issue, and yet these two didn't, which would suggest that the outliers here was them themselves. And I found myself pretty disappointed he never really digs into that. In fact, there is more in this documentary to suggest that the two were bullied, which has been proven by many, including themselves, that they were in fact not the bullied ones at the high school, but the bullies at their school. On the other hand, Moore also notes how American society is saturated with fear, with more critiquing 24-hour news cycles, sensational crime reporting, and political rhetoric that exaggerates threats to maintain viewership and control. Which is fair enough, yeah. That stuff has only gotten worse with time, and it comes from both sides of the political spectrum. It's pretty easy to get lost in the weeds of it all after a while. By the last third of the film, more interviews survivors, the victims' families, and individuals permanently injured by gunfire. One particular sequence follows two Columbine survivors who confront Kmart executives over the company's sale of ammunition that was used in the shooting, ultimately prompting the retailer to announce an end to the handgun ammunition sales. More than interviews NRA leadership and highlights the organization's close ties to gun manufacturers and conservative politics.
I just love these boulevards down here, though. Yeah. You don't get this in most of LA.
How come whenever I'm out here, though, I turn on the 11 o'clock news and I hear, tonight in South Central, drive-by shooting, or tonight in South Central, this, that, or whatever. They're not making that up, are they?
No, they're not making it up, but they're choosing what they're covering. If you turn on TV, on the news, what are you going to hear about? Dangerous black guys, right? Mm-hmm. Unnamed black guy who, accused of some crime, or...
Right.
You're going to see pictures of black guys doing bad things and hearing stories about black guys doing bad things. And we've heard this our whole...
One of the film's most controversial moments occurs when Moore then attempts to confront NRA President Charlton Heston, criticizing the organization for holding rallies shortly after mass shootings. And there was a very strange cut at this point in the film that doesn't really make sense, that if you're paying attention implies that the footage was cut up a lot during this section to add to the drama or something, making much of it kind of difficult to take seriously. By the end of the documentary, the title of the doc is referenced, noting the fact that the Columbine shooters went bowling the morning of the massacre, it being perhaps the last bit of normalcy they ever had before they did what they did. And it also underscores the film's insistence that violence cannot be explained by single causes or neat narratives, which again is fair enough, but it still seems to suggest that it was society that failed them in some way, when I think this whole thing would have been much more interesting had it also been applied to Eric and Dylan, what they enjoyed, who they were as people, etc., and specifically point out their accountability that so many have seemed to try to strip away from them simply because the awful truth that two teenagers could do such a terrible thing seemed to be indigestible to most at the time. But I suppose that wasn't really the part of the narrative that this film was trying to go for, which was mostly for more gun control in the United States, which regardless of your opinions on that one way or another, I just found much of the documentary more a product of its time, perhaps, that while still interesting, seems to get a bit lost in its societal analysis that ultimately has no definitive conclusion in the film, no core thesis. Instead of looking at what made this individual case or any individual case of violence happen, who was the man or men behind those guns sort of thing, the film kind of just stops short of that. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. For what it's worth, it is an extremely influential documentary all the same, and would end up launching Michael Moore's career for many documentaries to come, as well as several other documentaries that would sort of follow a similar vein. This kind of confrontational, satirical tone, mixed with some sort of overall message. I did find it funny that he randomly decided to trespass on a bunch of Canadian houses to prove some sort of point about it being far safer there, though. Bro's ass could have had a hole in him at any moment doing that. Or perhaps chase down the street, and you know that, he ain't getting far if that were to happen. Not to mention, he kind of shot himself in the foot with a point that he made earlier in the film, when he tried to compare the gun violence in America versus Canada, when at the time, they both had handguns and the like. And he himself even noted a major difference at the time between the two countries, which accidentally implied something that he was trying to dissuade earlier. But anyway, speaking of bowling for Big Macs, Super Size Me. This one is also quite popular and rather controversial for several reasons that we're gonna get to. Super Size Me is a 2004 documentary directed by and starring Morgan Spurlock, in which he uses his own body as a test subject to examine the health consequences of fast food consumption, specifically that of McDonald's. The film is also a broader critique on the culture of corporate food, marketing, and personal responsibility in the United States. For 30 consecutive days, Spurlock eats only McDonald's food, 3 meals a day, with several self-imposed rules. He must eat everything on the menu at least once. He must supersize his meal whenever offered, and he must limit physical activity to the national average. If you're wondering, back in the day, McDonald's used to do a supersize option, which is basically a larger than large option, and called it supersize. You could get supersized fries, drinks, etc. But this was eventually discontinued. As the experiment progresses, the documentary tracks Spurlock's physical and psychological deterioration. He gains significant weight, experiences mood swings, depression, fatigue, liver damage, and dramatic rise in cholesterol. Medical professionals monitoring him grow increasingly alarmed, with one doctor comparing his liver condition to that of a chronic alcoholic.
The results for your liver are obscene beyond anything I would have thought.
Yeah.
Truly, you're pickling your liver. Yeah. And you're kicking it while it's down now. Now it's down, and you're kicking it further. I mean, if you're an alcoholic, I'd say I say you're gonna die. You keep drinking, you'll die.
Which, we'll get to that comment again in a moment. In between all this stuff, Spurlock examines how fast food is marketed, especially to that of children, highlighting the use of toys and mascots, as well as school partnerships to normalize unhealthy eating habits from a young age. He contrasts this with the rising obesity rates, increasing healthcare costs, and the erosion of the nutritional education in schools, etc., etc. And by the end of the 30-day experiment, Spurlock's physicians were surprised at the degree of deterioration of his health in just 1 month on eating only McDonald's food. And while the film is kind of interesting in the same way all those videos you see on YouTube where some guy eats only X for X amount of days is kind of interesting, I think the major differences are, in those cases, it's done for fun, while here there is a very clear message that Spurlock wants to get across that is muddled by 2 factors. The first being the whole experiment is pretty unscientific, and many have also called into question the weight gain of this film. With Tom Naughton's Reply documentary, Fathead, yes, you heard that right, Reply documentary, stating that Spurlock's calorie and fat counts just simply do not add up, and that furthermore, Spurlock refused to publish the Super Size Me food log, which again muddles the water, and also means that the experiment doesn't even show any real results, which means it can't be studied or replicated, and also means that at any point he could have just staged some of it at some point, eaten way more than he said he did, eaten something else than just McDonald's, or perhaps drank something else. This is the second element that honestly kind of just discredits this entire film's concept. That being Spurlock's alcohol consumption. Remember when the doctors thought that he had a liver of an alcoholic, and how they were shocked that this was done through just eating fast food? Well, as it turns out, to no one's surprise, eating a bunch of fast food for a month, in fact, does not make you have the liver of a chronic alcoholic. That comes from being a chronic alcoholic. And this info was revealed by Spurlock himself when he noted in his own words that he drank copious amounts of alcohol during the making of this film. While this doesn't account for all the weight gain, it does account for many of the health problems that he already had and how they might have been exacerbated by his now much harsher diet, in addition to possibly eating way more than he claimed that he was eating, since without that food log, it really is anyone else's guess as to how much he actually ate. And since he went into this experiment with a clear narrative to sell to everyone, he kind of needed it to be an extremely bad outcome health-wise and weight gain wise. Because if it was just something minor, then most probably wouldn't have cared. It wouldn't have made any sort of impact, which is kind of sad because the reality is, yes, a lot of this stuff can be quite unhealthy for you, but it doesn't come from 1 month of eating nothing but that. It comes from years of just kind of eating whatever you want and just not really working out or taking the time to be any healthier. This instead just kind of comes off as extremely cartoonish and just disingenuous overall. And yet, however, while we obviously know all this information now, at the time of this documentary, it was massively popular and had a serious impact in that 6 weeks after the film's debut, McDonald's discontinued its supersized portion options. And while they claim that this decision had nothing to do with the film, it was pretty damn obvious it was because of this film. And this documentary also launched Spurlock's career, in which he would make several more documentaries, including our very next entry, Super Size Me 2 Holy Chicken. Yep, there was a sequel, though it was done a long time later, around 15 years later in fact, in the year of 2017. Now, while you might assume this one will be another experiment where he only eats something again for like a month or whatever, maybe KFC this time, this documentary is actually quite a bit different from the first one. This one shows focus away from the whole personal physical endurance experiment bullshit stuff, and instead focuses on some of the more deceptive practices in the modern fast food industry, and in particular the chicken industry, for lack of a better term. Spurlock's goal is to open up his own personal fast food restaurant, deliberately named Holy Chicken, in order to navigate the same regulatory, marketing, and supply chain systems used by major corporations. By doing so, he aims to demonstrate how easily ethical and natural and healthy branding can be manufactured, without meaningfully changing how food is produced. Noting how words like natural, free range, artisan, and sustainable dominate menus, despite having little to no enforceable legal definition. As Spurlock attempts to source chickens for Holy Chicken, the film exposes the harsh realities of industrial poultry farming. And while you might expect that means a lot of chickens in tight quarters and eventually being set off to their deaths and what have you, there is strangely a much more bizarre element to it all that I personally hadn't heard of before. That being how every poultry farm within that area gets paid based on a ranking system on how big the chickens are, as well as how many of them there were. Meaning that if you're on the bottom of the list despite producing the same amount of chickens, because maybe they're smaller or they're more defective or for really any reason, you'll get paid less. And since it costs so much to keep those chickens and farms going, it means more loans, or more depending on those same conglomerates of big chicken, I suppose you could call it, in creating a strange death cycle, where you can only just barely get by, while constantly still feeding into the machine. And that's on top of them being able to also just rank you or any farmer that they like on the very bottom for any random reason that they like, that has nothing to do with the actual chicken grades at all. Something that's actually showcased in the documentary when the poultry farmer that Spurlock is working with ends up on the bottom of the list because there were several people that found out that he was working with Spurlock on the documentary about this topic, which is pretty damn corrupt and messed up. When Spurlock's restaurant Holy Chicken does finally open up, he markets it using the same buzzwords and aesthetics that he spent the film criticizing. Customers respond enthusiastically, praising the restaurant's perceived ethics, despite the food being sourced from the same compromised system. This deliberate irony forms the documentary's core argument that consumer trust is easily engineered, and good intentions alone are no defense against structural dishonesty. And to his credit, I think this documentary definitely gets his point across much better, and has information that actually does bring stuff to the table table that maybe you wouldn't have known otherwise. I know I certainly learned a thing or two from it. I have a feeling this documentary would have gone over much better with people, as a matter of fact, because it's also frankly just less boring than the 2004 Super Size Me film, since it actually has some kind of point beyond, "Oh man, I'm eating so much fucking McDonald's and I feel like fucking shit. Guys, this really says something about society or something." However, there is just one little problem with Super Size Me 2. An issue that has actually very little to do with the documentary or its subject matter, but rather that of its director and main character, Spurlock. Because Spurlock effectively cancelled himself before the film was to come out on YouTube Red, and thus it wouldn't even actually get released until 2019, despite it being done by 2017. So how does Spurlock cancel himself then? Well, he admitted to a history of sexual misconduct, which was spurred on by the Me Too movement at the time. And he also admitted to being unfaithful to every wife and girlfriend he ever had. He also admitted in a blog post later that he himself had been a victim of sexual abuse as a boy and teenager, and that he had consistently been drinking since the age of 13 because of it. So, yeah. And ultimately, Spurlock would come to step away from the limelight after all of this. And then, by May 23rd of 2024, Spurlock would then pass away from complications of an unspecified cancer at the age of 53, ultimately leaving behind a influential, if not rather spotty, legacy. Bulgaria's Abandoned Children, Parts 1 and 2. Okay, fair warning with this one. I will only be showing limited amounts of footage during this entire section, because this is genuinely extremely upsetting. It is probably the best example of what I mean when I say this iceberg has no real clear structure, because in any other iceberg, this documentary might be near the bottom. But with that being said, Bulgaria's Abandoned Children is a harrowing investigative documentary that exposes the conditions inside state-run institutions for children with disabilities in post-communist Bulgaria. Originally broadcast as part of the BBC's Panorama Strand and reported by Kate Blewett, the film confronts viewers with images and testimony that reveal not isolated neglect, but a consistent, disgusting, evil, and horrifying abuse from these children on both an individual and bureaucratic sense. What do I mean by that? Well, the documentary focuses on children labeled as uneducatable or incurable, many of whom were abandoned shortly after birth due to disabilities, poverty, or social pressure. Once placed in remote institutions, these children were effectively removed from public life. The film shows overcrowded wards, children left unattended for hours, inadequate medical care, and severe malnutrition. Many were restrained to beds or cribs, deprived of stimulation, affection, or meaningful human interaction of any kind. Conditions that accelerate physical and cognitive deterioration, almost as if they sort of wanted that to happen, so that they could finally be rid of them. Blewett's reporting emphasizes how diagnosis functioned as a destiny here. Children with potentially imaginable conditions, such as cerebral palsy or developmental delays, were grouped together with those requiring intensive care, receiving the same minimal attention regardless of individual needs. The absence of education, therapy, or emotional support meant that even children capable of progress were condemned to stagnation. Deaths from preventable causes were common, and record keeping was often vague or non-existent. The documentary also interrogates the role of the state during Bulgaria's transition from communism into a market economy. As international attention focused on economic reform and European integration, institutionalized children remained invisible. It's a really rough film to watch. The camera lingers on faces, bodies, and silences at the Mongolia social care home, and some of the patients there, including that of Milan, a gentle soul who spends his day doing chores and watching over others, before then being beaten by one of the staff members. Or that of Didi, a mildly autistic girl who's passionate and talkative and has all the general interests of anyone else, but unfortunately has no one to speak to about anything here in this facility. Didi was also callously abandoned by her mother, and she unfortunately sits with the hope that her mother will eventually come back for her at some point, when in reality, the Mongolia social care home had already contacted Didi's mother, and her mother apparently wants nothing to do with her. It's heartbreaking and truly horrible, but important to be made. It was important that these things, these crimes against humanity, against children, against innocence, be made public, because through that, real change happened for these kids. And there is, in fact, thankfully, happy endings for all of them now. After the film was released in 2007, there was a public outcry and outrage at the state of all of this, with viewers forming strong petitions targeted at MPs and European Parliament demanding change for the disabled hidden away in Bulgaria's barren institutes. Other viewers raised money and gathered clothing and toys together to deliver to specific institutes in Bulgaria, and others coming there themselves to offer their professional help in getting these kids the treatment that they deserve. The children who were once in the Mongolia social care home where they were abused every day have all since been given new placements across the country, where they're finally getting the treatment that they deserve, with both Milan and Didi as an example being in much better places now, with some sort of future ahead of them both, taken care of and understood instead of abused, and both of them also have friends now as well. It's truly heartwarming to see after everything that these children went through, as some of them were genuinely on the brink of death, and now, thankfully, have all been given a second chance at life. The Lost Children of Mongolia. While we're on the topic, The Lost Children of Mongolia is a stark documentary, a rather short one, that exposes the lives of homeless children living on the streets, as well as beneath them, in post-Soviet Mongolia. It's set primarily in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia's capital during the brutal winter months, after the dissolving of the Soviet support in the early 1990s. Mongolia's economy collapsed almost overnight. Widespread unemployment, inflation, and alcohol abuse destabilized families, leaving many children abandoned, orphaned, or driven from abusive homes. The film presents street life not as a delinquency, but as a last resort for children with nowhere else to go. One of the documentary's most haunting revelations is that many of these children live in underground heating tunnels beneath the city. These tunnels, which carry hot water pipes, provide warmth during the sub-zero winters and become makeshift shelters for them. But they must also be careful because those same pipes can grow in heat to such a degree that they can burn the skin and flesh from one's hand, something some of the kids who mistakenly chose to sleep on top of the pipes for warmth had unfortunately discovered. The film also shows these kids, some as young as 6, scavenging for food, stealing coal to sell, and inhaling glue to numb hunger and emotional pain, rather than relying relying on narrative alone, The Lost Children of Mongolia allows the kids to speak for themselves too. They describe abuse at home, neglect by authorities, and the constant danger of street life, violence from older youths, exploitation by adults, and the ever-present threat of freezing to death. It's all pretty damn brutal, and that's on top of the undercurrent of invisibility, as many simply walk by these kids, ready to allow them to be forgotten, some quite literally dying in the street over scraps. These children exist outside official systems, unregistered, uneducated, and largely unseen by the public. By living underground, they become a literal metaphor for how society has buried the problem rather than confronting it. Probably the saddest part is after an officer ends up saving some kids and getting them some clean clothes and food and water, and then the next morning he goes around taking them back to their homes. But unfortunately, their parents seem indifferent and don't really seem to care about their own son or daughter's presence one way or another, almost looking at the officer with a "why did you bring them back" sort of look. It's really sickening. And before long, after this, the kids are back on the streets within the hour, preferring that to their abusive household where their father beats them.
You're going to have to keep a closer eye on your children, ma'am. We can't let this happen again. Try to build a warm home where they feel comfortable, so that they don't want to leave all the time, and if it happens again, come and see me at the home right away. Do you think they're going to go back to the streets?
Yes, there's a good chance it will happen again.
Why? Because the family environment is conducive to that. As you can see, there was nothing to eat in the yogurt shop today.
Geno Samuel and Sachuno's Chris Chan documentaries. So I sort of alluded to this earlier in the Tiger King entry, but we won't be just covering mainstream or big film documentaries on this iceberg. We'll also be covering some internet ones as well, and I feel like there's probably no better subject to introduce that of the internet and this sort of documentary type than that of Chris Chan, an individual who has garnered the attention of millions online. At first, for their strange webcomic called Sonichu that combines Sonic and Pikachu from the Sonic the Hedgehog and Pokemon franchises respectively to make his very own original Do Not Steal character, to later for his extremely strange mannerisms and general thoughts, to eventually the ongoing trolling events, story arcs, and eventually downward spiral and complete mental breakdown of them, one that eventually found them in prison for allegedly raping their dementia-ridden mother. Many have made documentaries on Chris Chan over the years, with the most comprehensive and longest being that of Geno Samuel, who painstakingly covers every aspect of Chris Chan's life from birth to current day. It is in an episodic format that I think everyone should probably see at least once if you enjoy documentaries, and especially if you like looking into the mind of one of the most strange yet iconic figures on the internet, as well as the world's most documented person as well, apparently. Geno's documentary is not only comprehensive, but it's also fairly objective, never allowing any one true judgment to come from their documentation, with it instead meant more as a means of telling their story as it is, warts and all. Due to this, there are times when the story is very funny, times when it's also extremely sad, and times when it's even truly disturbing beyond words. And what I personally quite like about the documentary is how clips from Chris's many videos are allowed to play out, sometimes in full, with them simply speaking for themselves. It makes for a long watch, but one that is nonetheless gripping. This documentary series also really hit the mainstream, again around the time of Tiger King's success as well, as more and more people were looking for strange figures to spend hours learning about from their bedrooms. And what better one to start out with than Chris Chan, who has this documentary series that is quite literally hours, days worth of content to sink one's teeth into. However, while Geno Samuel's phenomenal Christian documentary series is truly a great achievement as far as online documentation goes, I feel like it's worth noting the documentary that started it all though. The first real Christian documentary, and the one that got many, besides those who were already interested in him before, up to speed to quickly learning about who exactly Christian was. And that documentary is simply titled Christian Documentary by YouTuber Sachuno. This documentary is a more standard 2-hour length, but is nonetheless very informative and was released all the way back in 2015. It showcasing how exactly Christian was at that point in time, but also noting the many story arcs of their tale, and the various trolls and women in his life that much of the early Christian stories centered around. The good old days, as some people like to call them. It also gives special attention to Christian's love quest, which coincided with many of those things too. I also quite like Sachuno's final note upon the subject, and why there is a bit of a divide in people's thinking when it comes to Christian.
If you want me to show you the bad side of Christian, I can. If you want me to show you the bad side of the trolls, I can. That being said, there's no good or bad side in this fight of Troll versus Chandler. You can defend whomever you want, but the truth is, the whole aurora of negativity that surrounds Chris is a bad thing. It is a bad thing that people try to wreck his life at every turn, but it is just as bad for Chris himself to turn around and give it right back to the trolls. And then on the outside of the borders of hate are the people that want to document Chris. I can't say if it's wrong to study someone and archive most of their life. Like I have said before, that is for you to decide. When people hear about someone like Chris, they don't get angry because he can be an autistic goofball who loves to jump around and get mad at the camera. Although I am sure there's a big part of that. They get angry because they feel cheated by society. Christian is an example of everything that could have gone wrong with a modern day child, and he has managed to get away with it. Chris has refused to grow up and live like a normal person, blaming every problem either on trolls or his autism. On the other hand, Chris is still a victim. He's a victim of a fight that has gone on since the Industrial Revolution. Chris on one side being the group that thinks life is too hard, so they should rely on the sweat of others' work and mope around all day doing nothing productive. On the other spectrum, there's the people that believe you should work for what you have, and to use any government needs programs would just be a symbol of submitting to laziness. These are usually the kind of people that hate Christian.
Is extremely well made, and needless to say, I don't think enough people give Sachuno credit that he rightfully deserves for making one of the most influential videos on YouTube. Even if you want to watch the Geno Samuel series, I recommend watching the Sachuno one first, just because it gives you a quick rundown of a lot of his antics and the general vibe of him. So that way when you go into Geno Samuel's documentary and you see all the more nitty-gritty details, as well as the stuff that comes way later past 2015, I find that you can kind of appreciate it a little bit more. Sachuno's documentary define not only how many people cover Christian, but also quite often how many people cover documentaries on internet folks as well. Truly Kino stuff. Earthlings. This one is very gruesome, so fair warning. For this reason, yet again I will only be showing very limited footage. Released in 2005, Earthlings, directed by Sean Monson and narrated by Joaquin Phoenix, is a confrontational animal rights documentary that argues humanity's exploitation of non-human animals is normalized, institutionalized, and largely hidden from public view, all of these things being bad. Structured as an ethical indictment rather than a neutral investigation, the film seeks to expose how everyday consumer practices depend on the suffering that is rendered invisible by distance and custom. The documentary is organized around a simple but radical kind of premise. The animals are sentient beings whose interests are routinely subordinated to human convenience for profit. From this foundation, Earthlings surveys 5 major domains of human use: that of pets, food, clothing, entertainment, and scientific research, arguing that each relies on similar mechanisms of objectification of the animals. It's pretty aggressive of his message, and there is a ton of footage of animal slaughter and animal suffering, everything from cows being killed in multiple fashions, dogs dogs being put down, pigs being tortured in, frankly, a lot of very gruesome ways, to animals being literally skinned alive, and even elephants being needlessly and horrifically abused. Walking Phoenix's somber narration provides philosophical framing, invoking concepts like speciesism, that is, the belief that one species' interests are inherently superior to another's. The film does not offer counter-arguments or industry defenses, nor does it attempt to balance in the journalistic sense. Instead, it positions itself as a moral witness, asserting that neutrality in the face of suffering is in of itself a form of complicity. If you haven't caught on, this documentary has a very vegan message, and while many of his points are fair, and there's a lot of stuff that I think most would find somewhat agreeable, especially given the horrific footage, it's hard not to feel like it starts to fall into the same delusions that Timothy the Grizzly Man falls into. What I mean by this is at some point, the question must be asked, if we are all creatures of Earth, and us killing another resident of Earth is a violation, does that not then mean that all of nature, where death and murder is a constant every single day and night, is that not then natural, or is it, as the film proposes, violating nature and the laws of this world? Does the owl existing, and eventually hunting and killing the rat, possibly to feed to its children, a violation, or is it just simply nature? Cruel and gross as it may be, you know? I suppose the film may say that humans have a moral imperative to be better than that, since I suppose we are more self-conscious of these things. But to be fair, the film never really addresses that in any meaningful way, so I'm not really sure what its take on that would be. Regardless of how you feel about the message though, it is a really uncomfortable watch, and certainly shows cases where the violence against the animals are needlessly violent without any reason. And I really do not recommend you watch it unless you are specifically prepared for that. In the end though, it is showing the objective reality of these things, so what you ultimately take away from it is up to you. But I'd be lying if I didn't say it was genuinely the most upsetting documentary that I have seen thus far on the iceberg. The Dungeon Masters. So for the final entry of this tier, we have a bit of a lighter one to end things out on, and also one of my personal favorites. Released in 2008, The Dungeon Masters is a documentary that explores Dungeons & Dragons, not through its creators or controversies, or even its history, but through the lives and stories of 3 players. The documentary following these 3 individuals and how their lives were both shaped and sometimes saved by these role-playing games. These subjects include people struggling with social anxiety, depression, trauma, identity, and isolation. For them, Dungeons & Dragons is not merely entertainment, but a structured space where imagination provides stability, agency, and a general connection to the world that often feels so very hostile or overwhelming. The 3 Dungeon Masters, or Game Masters as they call themselves in the documentary, are that of Scott Coram, Richard Meeks, and Elizabeth Reisman, all 3 of which are rather interesting in their own ways. Scott Coram is sort of who I'd call the main character throughout much of the documentary, as it follows him and his ambitions to be a creative writer, while also supporting his family. Meanwhile, Richard Meeks is this real character of a guy who on one hand takes his D&D sessions extremely seriously, while also being a well-kept businessman, while also having a background in military service, while also being a part-time and passionate nudist, as well as becoming an up-and-coming Jew. He's, quite the interesting case, to say the least. Lastly, there is Elizabeth Reisman, who goes beyond just D&D and actually goes to full-on LARPing sessions, and also dresses up and paints herself fully in black to get into her character, a dark elf. Which sort of reminds me of that one story of the Homestuck fan using a whole bathtub full of Sharpie ink to turn themselves gray. I'm also pretty sure her general aesthetic is what inspired Chang's character in that one episode of Community. You know the one. She is also involved in a lot of relationship drama in her story, as the documentary is kind of filmed over the course of a year or so. So she kind of changes where she's living and what her general arrangements are, and even what her goals in life and where she wants to work at is quite frequently, which makes it quite interesting to see her story progress. As the documentary goes on, we get kind of into the mind of Scott Coram as we understand his background, how he was bullied as a kid, and how Dungeons & Dragons sort of gave him a bit of a purpose, an outlet to express himself creatively. And eventually, we even see his ambitions to make a little TV show thing, where he's a late-night TV show host and also a supervillain named Uncle Drac. Maybe it's best if I let the video explain itself.
I had it all. A destiny, an army of rental ninjas, money, fame, power, women, everything a villain needed, including a nemesis. No matter my plan, Action Vic was there to stop me. Soon, no matter what I was trying to do. The defeats mounted, my finances were ruined. I had lost the ability to wage the war on goodness. What could a villain do but start a cable access show and try to take over the world?
Which I do find extremely charming, but also, strangely, just a little bit sad, in that so much of what he's trying to do ends up not fully working out quite how he wanted it to. And at some point, his book, which he spent so much time and effort on, and whom he and his editor throughout the whole documentary have been improving and trying to find publishers for, and so much excitement and momentum was going on for it, is eventually finished by the editor, who subsequently says that she hates it. This book that he's been working on for a year, that he had all these ambitions to have published and thought that he was finally going to make something out of his creative writing, is sort of tossed aside at that point, as he starts to doubt himself all the more. He starts to feel like no matter what he does, it just doesn't quite amount to anything. Meanwhile, we eventually come to understand that Richard Meeks has sort of ruined past D&D campaigns by killing off the entire group's party and then making them tear up their character sheets after those same campaigns went on for years. Campaigns that he specifically wrote out to have gone on for years, but never actually getting finished. In fact, he seems to have a rather interesting habit of never letting a story finish. He has so many stories, so many campaign concepts, so many ideas that never get told, never get to be seen through. Maybe it's because he's too willing to let the characters die or kill them off. Or maybe, as the documentary sort of suggests at some point, it's because in his life he has a tendency to run away from things before they're finished. It's honestly a rather quiet documentary that's more about three interesting people in their different lives and goals up until this point, that just so happens to also enjoy D&D. It's something that may put off some at first if you were expecting it to be more about the game itself and its history and what have you. But to me, there is something really interesting about this kind of documentary that just kind of captures a small piece of someone's life and time, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and ultimately kind of leaves you wondering where they all went off to do after the whole thing is over. I highly recommend giving it a watch if it at all sounds interesting to you. And as far as updates go, I can personally attest that ever since first seeing the documentary many years ago, I have followed Scott Coram's YouTube channel, where he has a series called Matters of Decorum, where he kind of just shares aspects of his life and what's going on with him. And at one point, he even talked in depth with his experiences with the Dungeon Masters documentary, and how he feels about it all now. It overall being a positive experience, but him noting that it's interesting that it caught him during a time in his life when things were going especially bad. I've also been following him throughout the years as he talked about Dungeons and Dragons, video games, and all sorts of other nerdy type stuff. It eventually washed as he battled with cancer and fought it off for some time. Now, the thing is, I had it in mind to talk about this guy for quite some time, since his documentary was one that randomly stuck with me, like a few others that I'll come to share as this iceberg goes on. And originally, I had this section here where I was going to recommend you go and check out his stuff, and tell him the Night Owl sends you, hoot hoot, and all that sort of shit. But I only just recently, as in while I was editing this video, found out that Scott sadly passed away. I'm not sure on the details, but I imagine it was the cancer that he had been fighting off for some time. This put me in a sort of odd position of introducing this guy I'd always meant to introduce to you, right as he had passed away. However, I still recommend you go and check his stuff out though. From his early Uncle Drac videos and skits, to many of his musings and thoughts on creative writing and what have you, to even his most recent stuff, because the channel chronicles the man's many creative ventures and ideas and thoughts, and I think that, if nothing else, is something well worth cherishing. So, rest in peace to a true king, creative writer, and of course, game master. Ask for the other two. I couldn't find much info on Richard Meeks though, so no news there. By the end of the documentary, he ends up marrying his then fiancée and entering into the Jewish faith, so I guess that's as far as we're gonna get to know. As for Elizabeth Reisman, from my own research, she seems to be doing quite well for herself and works in technology at the moment, and has been for quite a few years. By the end of this documentary, there is kind of a moment that I wasn't really sure if the directors intended it or not, but that I found pretty interesting in its final moments all the same. It seemed to imply that while the documentary was about these dungeon masters, these people who play Dungeons and Dragons and come up with all these stories for their friends to play out, on a philosophical level, none of them, or us, are dungeon masters in the game of life. Or at least, not very often. That so much of it is up to chance, a roll of the dice, or held aloft by the true dungeon masters who control so much of this world. Especially with the documentary often having audio of wars going on in other countries, or the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, or this overwhelming sense of danger and sadness going on in the background that is never truly addressed at any given point during the documentary, instead focusing on individuals who are just trying to find their way through life and do their best even if mistakes are made, even if they fail often, and can never seem to finish their stories or get exactly what they want done. But there is at least meaning in playing the game, I suppose. The game of life, and still trying your best. Even if you end up losing from time to time, there's always something, or someone worth still playing for. And maybe, while we're all just players to the dungeon masters of this world, in creation, in art, in doing the things we love, in simply trying, we are then, for once, the dungeon masters, win or lose. And that is something always worthwhile.
Life has the weight of a great story behind it, depending on how you live your life. I think of a lot of the world as very gray. There's a lot of people out there. But where was the greatness? Real greatness, there's risk, there's challenge. There are things I can't reach. But while I don't have that greatness, I've got a story that no one else has had before. And that is something that you own.
Where you were expecting to find a desolate hillside, now a massive city of squat stone spreads away like a dark, festering scab. You plunge through opaque mists that whip past your face with an icy chill, beating towards a barely visible spark of light. A solitary imperfection in an otherwise perfect void.
that is it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all so very much for watching this video all the way through. I'm very excited to get started on this brand new Iceberg series. And the thing is, it's not the only one I'm currently working on, so stay tuned for more info on what the other one might be about. But regardless, let me know what you guys thought of it so far. Which documentaries have you seen or perhaps are gonna go check out after seeing this video? I want to note again, this Iceberg is gonna kind of follow whichever docs catch my eye, and so you never really know which will be featured next. I have a list of documentaries I plan on watching, and I'm still currently adding more to it, because I really love documentaries, as you might imagine, with all the sort of stuff that I create on my channel. So this one's a real passion project of mine at this point, to share a bunch of these with you guys, and talk about a bunch of interesting, weird, disturbing, or just plain obscure topics. And if you have any suggestions for documentaries that you would like to see me cover in this Iceberg series, be they movie or internet based, be sure to comment down below and maybe tell me just a little bit about them without spoiling too much. That way I can go in mostly blind. But with that said, I hope you all have a very lovely day. Thank you to all my patrons and channel members for continuing to support the channel and all that I do. There will be some exclusive content for you guys coming very soon. This has been Dylan the Night Owl, flying off.